Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Vanessa Reed, the President and CEO of New Music USA, which is a national resource supporting new music creation, discovery, and community across the US. We are really thrilled to present this webinar for you today in partnership with the Ojai Music Festival in California and members of the brilliant interdisciplinary performance group AMOC, who curated the last edition of the festival, which took place earlier this year in June. This webinar is part of an ongoing series that New Music USA is hosting for our national community, with each event centered around a topic that's important to the music creators, performers, and music lovers that we're here for. And today's topic for discussion is interdisciplinary collaboration. And we're really grateful to have several members of AMOC with us today to share their insights in conversation with Ara Guzelimian, the Artistic and Executive Director of Ojai Festival. I was lucky enough to be at the last festival in June, and I enjoyed it immensely. And so I'm really excited to hear today's panelists reflecting on what they experienced and what they achieved with that program, how the audience responded, and how they made it happen. And I do remember one of the AMOC artists pointing out in the opening talk at the festival that AMOC is a 19-member collective operating via Google Docs. So that sounds like quite a task to me, and I really am looking forward to hearing about the benefits and challenges of working in this collaborative way. Before I pass it over to Ara to introduce himself and today's guests, I want to thank all of you who are watching today's webinar and who are here to take part. If you haven't already said hello in the chat, please do, and let us know where you're calling in from. And we're also going to be leaving around 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end of this discussion, which we're going to take through the chat. So please be thinking about what you want to know from today's panelists. So thanks again to all of you watching and to all of our guests today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ara to get the conversation going.
Thanks, Vanessa. It's lovely to be with everybody, but for me, a particular treat to be happily reunited with my AMOC friends, because although the festival was in June, the euphoria of working together has carried me through. I'm just so happy to see dancer and choreographer Bobbi Jean Smith, who's joining us from Los Angeles, where she's currently based, composer Matthew Aucoin, and one title isn't enough for Matt. It's probably composer, pianist, conductor, and an Ojai percussionist, Matthew Aucoin, and Matt's joining us from Houston, where he's conducting Houston Grand Opera in La Traviata. Violinist, violist, composer, writer, scholar Keir GoGwilt, who's joining us from New York, and the just heavenly soprano, Julia Bullock, who's joining us from home in Munich. So it's really lovely to be with all of you. I will confirm the Google Docs story. It was one of my favorite moments in the planning of the Ojai Festival. Working with a collective, and it was the first time a collective had been the singular music director of the Ojai Festival and curated it in its 75-year history. And I think it was one of the most adventurous and far-reaching and satisfying Ojai festivals ever, thanks to AMOC. But one of my favorite moments was when we finally, after a very long collaborative process, settled on all of the programming and put together the press release announcing the festival. There was indeed a collective Google Doc that was edited by all of AMOC in real time. And I was on the Google Doc and I could see, with a map scattered all over the globe, it said, Julia Bullock changed this and Keir GoGwilt changed that. And it sounds like, you know, one of the more complex processes, but it's a tribute to AMOC that we ended up with a quite elegant and entirely accurate press announcement, collectively edited by about 14 people, I think. So everything about the way AMOC works, as I'm fond of saying, actually proves that democracy works, which isn't a bad reminder right now. So, Matt, let me begin with you. You and Zach Winokur, dancer, choreographer, stage director, really were in at the very beginning and founding AMOC, which stands for American Modern Opera Company. What need were you addressing? Why AMOC?
Well, first of all, it's really great to be here. Thanks to everyone who is tuning in, and I agree, Ara, it's nice to be reunited. I miss our long and frequent programming discussions. To the question of why AMOC, I think there's a short answer and a more nuanced one. The short answer is that we wanted to make work with our friends, with people that we knew and loved and trusted, which I think is justification enough in a way. And the more nuanced answer is that Zach and I both felt in our respective disciplines, Zach has a strong dance background, I of course have a musical background, and we both were working in opera. Opera was kind of where we converged. We felt that there were some curious qualities to the way that pre-existing institutions functioned, including the very notion of what a company is. If you think of an opera company, in a funny way, the people who are part of the company are everyone except the so-called principal artists, singers, conductors, directors, set designers, and so forth. These people come and go while an administration and of course an orchestra and chorus stays put. And this in a way seemed a bit backward to us. And Zach, with his profound dance experience, knew of course that a dance company is a real company. And, you know, so was the Duke Ellington Orchestra and so were the Beatles. You know, it's like you need to make work with people over a long period of time if you're going to develop a common language. And we felt that mainstream opera houses are not necessarily set up for that kind of in-depth collaboration. Singers, conductors, and so forth can't really choose their colleagues with sufficient agency. So really we wanted to build a company on a new model where the artists are the constant element. And also we wanted to center new work and to really empower every member of AMOC to bring to the company their most adventurous ideas, the things that mean the most to them, and maybe the things that didn't have an obvious home elsewhere. You know, we wanted to be, Devon has used the term the island of misfit toys, which I love. We wanted to be the place for things that kind of can't happen elsewhere. And a cornerstone for the company is also that everything we do is interdisciplinary in some way or other. We're not super interested in presenting straightforward concerts. Generally, there are meetings between dance, music, text, and we like to call that opera. So it's opera in the expanded sense.
Actually, everybody in AMOC is very active in their own individual creative work, but then you each devote a chunk of your year to life in AMOC. So Bobbi and Julia, let me ask each of you why AMOC in a sense, why make room in your life for the island of misfit toys part of your each year?
Amazing question, and so happy to be here with all of you. I feel what attracted me so much to AMOC was growing old with these artists and to age through making art together. And I still find that such a rewarding place to be in, that kind of, you can't compare it to anything else. You make your own history together. and or our own artistic history together. And I feel like that's something really powerful to me, that a lot of times in this art, you're meeting lots of people and it's incredible and people are passing by, but to kind of go on this journey together and to commit to each other in that way feels very meaningful and powerful.
Julia?
Yeah, agreed. Sorry, I'm swaying back and forth. Just in my last month of pregnancy and needing to move constantly. So forgive me.
It's in true AMOC fashion. You're dancing.
If you see me bouncing, I'm on a ball. Yeah, I'm right in line with what Bobbi mentioned, and I guess, yeah, it's funny, this island of misfits. I guess I don't know if I identify as a misfit. I think really what I'm always looking for, just people with whom I share values and vision, and that is so that has been not only just articulated amongst this group of artists, but I think it's something that we're really trying to put into practice, and that just feels honestly very comfortable and safe and exciting. Like we can just take risks together, grow together, and even and honestly just have legitimate collaborations, even if some things are not quote unquote successful. And like I think our definition of what a success is if we can step away and feel like we've learned something in the process. So that feels yeah, that's just it's becoming increasingly important as my work has gone on, because you asked about why work in some situations or environments to create create a vision of an artistic work, and versus working in another situation with these particular artists. And yeah, I don't know, I guess the the joy of just being amongst a group of people who are constantly asking questions and really seeking to build something together just feels really good.
Keir, you chaired the Ojai programming group, which takes lots of free-flowing ideas and eventually put them, I think if I remember the count right, 19 events at Ojai. How do you make collective programming decisions? How do you keep a balance among individuals and among disciplines, so that 19 events is a representative snapshot of all of AMOC at this particular moment?
With great difficulty, I would say. But yeah, I mean, it's, first of all, it's great to be here and to be in this space with you all. So, but yeah, to answer your question, I think actually it's funny that you mentioned AMOC as a democracy, and I think there's a lot of kind of truth in that, insofar as we are making a lot of collective decisions. But one of the things that I feel like democracy sort of implies is majority rule, or like voting, or those kinds of exercises in collective decision making. But we actually very rarely vote on anything, which is not to say the decisions aren't collective. I think it's more to say that we're very much like a functional anarchy, I think. Like we, there is no rhyme or reason. There are really no rules. And I think that's actually like tremendously liberating and actually necessary for us to continue working together, because like our visions for what the company should or might be are almost like incompatible with each other sometimes. And so a lot of what we end up doing is just trusting each other and kind of just going on that, and just like allowing space for things to fall apart or fail. and I really think more and more, I really think that that kind of, that mentality of like no rules, but everybody just like try and pick up the slack where and when you can. Like that really feels to me like the beating heart of how it works.
In one of our meetings together, I noticed an amazing document which compared, sort of put proposed project through a filter of standards, kind of AMOC ethos and various values. Could you talk about that? Because I was really struck by the clarity of stepping back and looking at each project through that filter.
For sure. That might have been the evaluation rubric that we had as a guide. And again, which we actually never ended up using as a voting guide, but it was just sort of there, ancillary to our discussions. But I think one of the categories was like suitability for Ojai. So you were definitely guiding us through that during the whole process. But then there was also a category of AMOC values, and we during the during the height of the pandemic, when we were all sort of isolating, we had a lot of discussions about our values, and we put together a pretty comprehensive value rubric that like included things like new work, power in the collective, fellowship, partnership, social consciousness, sustainability, all of these things, which, like they're very general and vague terms, but I think that they're sort of like important in guiding how we make decisions and like how we propose things to each other. And we don't rule out anything, because I think there are so many ways, so many dimensions in which these values can go. But it is just like a really nice sort of North Star for us to keep in mind.
You mentioned some of the work during the pandemic, actually. Can you talk a little about, there was a reading group that I think you helped organize that actually led to the George Lewis work and eventually Roscoe Mitchell work being performed and worked upon for Ojai, but that's even part of a much larger arc for a project that will be a collaboration with George Lewis in the future. And I'm also struck by AMOC seems to have the luxury of taking a long view of developing projects or exploring ideas that don't have a specific performance project yet. So if you could all talk a little about that luxury. Keir, maybe you can begin specifically about the George Lewis, but then if the others can pick up about this idea of exploring without a specific outcome in mind.
Yeah, I'll just briefly touch on the George Lewis reading group. We read the entirety of his book on the AACM, Power Stronger Than Itself, and I think that part of the impetus for reading it was that we knew we were going to premiere an opera of George's, but there was also the fact that it was a book about a collective. I mean, a collective in very different circumstances than ours. But nonetheless, it was also during a time I felt in which like AMOC might fall apart. Like we were like on the brink, as with so many other organizations, of like really having like existential questions. And I think one of the nice things about the book on the AACM was like it showed how tenuous a collective can be, and it showed that like even collectives like beyond the AACM that sort of like failed or like fell apart or dissolved were incredibly valuable for and enriching. So it was kind of like a really nice reminder of that. But yeah, passing it on to others.
Julia and Bobbi, I've noticed both of you nodding away when I said you can actually start working on something without a specific fixed project as the outcome. You can sort of pull on a thread. Do you want to talk a little about that process within AMOC?
Sure. I mean, even just for my own personal projects, I know from the sort of inception of an idea to it becoming actualized, it can take 3 to 5 years, and patience. And yeah, I think it's just being diligent in your research and also finding the individuals and or co-presenters to help bring it to a life outside of your head is just it just takes time. And the beauty with, I can just concretely say with Aucoin, for example, which we weren't able to premiere in Ojai, but that was just an idea that I had after I fell in love with the song cycle by Messian. And I had started doing just some sort of rudimentary research on the piece, some of its roots in dance traditions and music traditions from the Andes and from traditional Aucoin, and how Messian was utilizing those existing forms of dance and music to inform both his poetry and his lyrical material in all aspects, from music to writing. And it was a project that I was thinking, I guess it really was like 5 years ago or 6 years ago, and that I was planning in some way to do at the Met Museum, but then it kept getting postponed and postponed. But I discussed it with Zach Winokur because he and I became friends right around the time when he and Matt were thinking about founding AMOC. And I was also thinking about my own programming ideas. And that summer then I met Bobbi and Or. And because again, early on I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll do it with another singer, because also, and maybe who also has good movement background or something like myself. But then I met Bobbi and Or. I was like, well, these are two amazing thinkers, movers, choreographers. And I just turned to Zach when we were at dinner one night as a group, and I was like, hey, do you think this might be a cool do you think we can make a cool quartet with Connor playing piano, myself singing, and Bobbi and Or dancing? He's like, yeah, I think that's a great idea. And it took 5 years for it for us to find the time and the place to do it. And it still didn't happen when it was intended to happen at Ojai. But when we finally did debut it in Aix-en-Provence this summer, it was just a really exciting moment, I think, for all of us, because we really created the work together. And even in the early days of the rehearsal process, we just had hours and hours of going through the material, the poetry and the music, and considering Messiaen's history, and considering and in discussions with artist practitioners of Aucoin. And I'm really excited to share the piece now in as many places as we can over these next few years, whatever, for the rest of our lives, if we want to. But it was a really, just deep exploratory process. And, when I think it's really hard in some respects to say, oh yeah, okay, here's who's responsible for the dance, and here's who's responsible for the quote unquote staging and direction and the lighting and the costumes and the concept, whatever. It's like we all genuinely have space to share our perspectives and reflections on what we're doing. And I think that is one thing that makes working with this particular group of artists, or working in this way very intentionally and consciously, so satisfying, because, you know, I don't have to puff up my chest in a rehearsal room and posture as a person like fighting for a powerful voice and space. It's like we all are just sharing space in a really generous way. And when we're not, we call each other out on it. It's like a very, you know, it's a really fluid and engaged, it's just a really engaged process. Okay, I just spoke for like 5 minutes. I'm gonna let Bobbi talk.
Let me just frame it for those who don't know what we're talking about. This is Olivia Messian's song cycle, Arawi, for soprano and piano, which is about an hour-long piece. It is in its history a standard concert piece in AMOC's conception. It's a theatrical piece for Julia and the pianist Connor Hannock, another AMOC member, joined by Bobbi Jean Smith and Or Schreiber, who's another core AMOC member, extraordinary dancer. And Zach Winokur is credited, I think, as dramaturg or director, but the titles are almost sort of immaterial because, as Julia said, it's a collectively created piece. Bobbi, why don't you pick up the story from the moment this idea landed in your lap and to the realization of it, and also what Julia is referring to. It was meant to premiere at Ojai, but unfortunately she became ill literally on the eve of flying to California and couldn't travel, and we had to cancel it in Ojai. And the Devantines and AMOC collectively heroically devised a version of Devon's recital to save the day in pretty spectacular form. But the piece saw light at the Aix-en-Provence Festival in July of this year, and there are now plans for this production to live several times over in multiple locations. So, Bobbi, Julia and Zach quietly consult and think it's a fabulous idea to talk with you and Or about it, and the piece lands in your lap. What happens from there on?
So much happened. I mean, I feel like already when it did land or meet us, so much had already been brought to the table by what Julia had been investigating and also all the piece contains. When we first met at the Armory to start like kind of looking back, almost pre-process, another pre-process. I love in AMOC sometimes the pre-process can feel like another pre-process, and it's like an ongoing discovery time. And when I first heard the piece when Julia and Connor were rehearsing it, kind of both Or and I looked at each other like, how are we going to meet this? And where is the dance? And how will we? I already felt like they were dancing. So always the question is, what will adding two more people do? And how do we elevate the work more and together? And what are these roles that we're playing? And so we kind of just started to dissect it like crazy and got really lost in the void. The beautiful void of the poetry, and trying to understand what these four people, why would they all congregate and do this thing together? And so many beautiful questions came up, and then, you know, the piece starts to kind of answer the questions, and the process starts to answer the questions without, you know, where we start to not have any answers between the five of us, something else starts to fill in. That's when the magic starts to happen. Yeah, I don't want to give too much away. So
and I've so far only seen a very touching rehearsal in Ojai with Zach Winokur playing the role of Julia Bullock, at least in movement, if not singing. But what even the fragments I saw as you were rehearsing in Ojai, is it's not a concert work with dance. It's not dance made to music. It's a completely integrated work. the movement is not limited to the dancers. And can you talk a little about that process of how one makes an integrated multidisciplinary work rather than making a dance to a musical work?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things that came up or that always come up for me are, these are 4 people. Connor happens to play the piano. That is how he is expressing himself. Julia is singing. That is how she is expressing herself. And that's how they're dancing. I like to think that they're already dancing. It's not as if they now need to learn steps or we now need to somehow do this other language. We are all already speaking in the same language. And so trying to kind of amplify what's already there. And maybe it's, a gesture that Julia automatically, like unconsciously makes intuitively as she's singing. How do we amplify that? How do we make that bigger or smaller to then find this common language of gesture and listening between us?
We've been talking about a piece made to an existing work, the Messian. Let's switch to an even more complex process, which is a completely devised work that's a collectively devised work. And Bobbi, you took the lead both conceptually and even on stage in a sense. The piece is called, in its various iterations, either Broken Theater or Open Rehearsal. And it's very hard to summarize, but it's a piece that involves singers, instrumentalists, actors, dancers, in an exploration of a group of people trying to learn how to come back to being together. I saw it as a kind of post-pandemic piece and how to create together and how to interact, breaking our isolation. And I'm very fond of saying about AMOC, and it literally comes true in this piece. AMOC is a group of people where the musicians may dance and the dancers may sing, and both of them happened in this piece, and it involved Keir. It was to involve Julia, and I'm sure has in other incarnations and will again. How do you start a piece like that when it's a collectively devised piece? Who suggests which movement, how did the pieces that ended up being performed, which ranged from Bach to Pete Seeger to Connie Converse to Schubert, end up being a part of the piece, etc.?
Good question. I have to say, it always, for at least my processes that I lead, it always starts with the people first. It starts with kind of gathering the people, the players in the room, and then it's just a lot of dreaming and talking and imagining and playing around and giving time to each other and seeing what is revealed in the room. So it's a lot less of like trying to say, this is the idea, this is the concept, this is what we're trying to say. It's kind of like, let's all get together, let's see what's there, what keeps showing up. And I mean, I always come in with a lot of ideas. Maybe I don't always share them because maybe that's for later, but trying to give space for things to appear. And people bring things to the table. It's an extremely collaborative process where I hope people feel authorship for things they bring forth, and forwards and sideways and downwards and upwards, and kind of trying to follow the breadcrumbs of throwing an idea out there, seeing what comes back. And I feel sometimes other people come in with ideas. Sometimes someone comes in with a piece of writing, let's go off of this. And it's just trying to like generate as much as we can.
But there was a lovely comment while you were talking after I introduced it, which I can't resist touching on. One of the webinar participants said, Connie Converse. I didn't expect to hear that name come up. And so maybe let's pull on that thread a little bit. How and where did the idea of a Connie Converse song come into it's kind of part of the core of the piece? Jules, is that you, or where did it begin?
Julia.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess. So it was with Zach. That's actually kind of cool. Zach Winokur, one of the founders of AMOC. We were hanging out one night in New York again, I think, I don't know how many years ago now. And he said, do you know this singer? We were sharing just our favorite recordings until like 2 a.m, and just going back and forth. And he said, have you heard of Connie Converse? I said, no, I haven't. And he played this album that she had recorded in the 1950s, where she was self-accompanying on the guitar. And I think it was recorded in somebody's living room. And as we were listening through, honestly, I think we listened to almost the whole album. And I thought, oh my God, I'm falling in love with this composer, this singer, songwriter. It was reminding me so much of some of my favorite Lieder, German art song. And I was again just waiting for the right opportunity to program some of her music on a recital, because one of my great joys in life is programming recitals for myself and a pianist. And so I commissioned an arrangement of One by One to perform as an encore, because I had already commissioned a bunch of other work by Black women writers Black women composers who wrote the blues. And so this song, I then, during the pandemic, my husband and I just recorded some songs from home and on my iPhone and released them about one every week or every 2 weeks. And Bobbi heard One by One and fell in love with the song. And yeah, I'll let her take it from there about how she wanted to then incorporate that into the piece. But
yeah, I mean, I think Zach introduced me to Connie Converse one day, in Vermont, immediately took the album and went and danced in the studio. And I have to say, like, I always kind of feel that I'm dancing for her. Whenever I don't know who I'm dancing for, I always think maybe Connie's going to show up. Maybe she's going to walk. Maybe she's in the audience today. And so then when Julia made this recording, I couldn't stop listening. And it was, we shortly after that, we went into process for the first edition of what will become Broken Theater. And it just was with us every day. So I'm very thankful for that.
Here I mentioned musicians dancing. You did what one would have thought the nearly impossible, which is playing the Bach chaconne while moving rather beautifully. Is there a moment where, as a performing musician, you drop either inhibition or resistance and say, okay, I'm going to move in a room full of dancers?
Well, yeah, I guess I like what Bobbi says about like playing an instrument, you're already dancing, because that kind of takes the pressure off a little bit. But I mean, there is that section where I play the Bach, and I think it's, I do stand in the same place. Like I mean, there are other bits where I'm moving around, but I don't want people to imagine that I'm like doing the whole like Lindsey Sterling thing, but yeah. But I mean, actually, one of the things that your discussion of how are we evoked for me was, I remember going to a dress rehearsal of that and like seeing everybody moving around, and Connor was just sitting at the piano, and I heard his chords differently, like the way that he inflected like a chord or a gesture. It became like a character in the space for me, and that was like hugely gratifying for me because I've been working within the context of Bobbi's dance theater since like 2016, and I've never had been outside of it. I've never been outside of like seeing musicians and dancers work together and like hearing just like the fact that it changed how I heard the music without Connor having to do anything particularly special, in terms of movement, just in terms of like, you know, his like intense interpretive imagination. Like that was really an enormous moment for me. So yeah.
And before we turn to Q&A, Matt, let me ask you just about another key element of the whole AMOC process, which is time spent together collectively on a farm in Vermont, and even the AMOC tradition of family dinner, which you have now created a piece called Family Dinner that honors that. How is that time together central to AMOC? And the rituals of that time together?
Yeah, I think this gets back to your question from earlier in the hour, Ara, about what you called the luxury of taking a lot of time on projects. I love Keir's description of us as a kind of functional anarchy. I was recently reading Ursula K. Le Guin's masterpiece, The Dispossessed, about an anarchist society. And I think we have, in a way, dispossessed ourselves of certain elements that create pressures. For example, we don't pay rent on a theater space. We don't promise to do the same kinds of shows every season, because I do think that creates well, we need this main stage show, and we really need to fill this size hall every year. And then you fall into a pattern, which can be fine, but the pattern that we really believe in, though, is the tradition you alluded to of gathering every summer in Vermont, where Zach and our friend Marta and my husband Clay and I all live, at least some of the time. And Vermont, in a way, because it's not a theater space in downtown Manhattan, because it is open farmland in a way, it's barns, is kind of a space to be held every year for experimentation and rehearsal, and just getting to know each other better. That was really essential, especially over the first few years of the company. It didn't always seem that everyone was doing a ton of work all the time, but this deeper work was happening because we were getting to know each other and listening to each other, and that makes later work possible. So in a company that has very few predictable or set patterns, that summer gathering is one that that's really vital.
By the way, I should also say, since we talked about Connie Converse and One by One, and that may be new to a lot of people listening, Julia's first solo album is coming out later in the year, and the first track to be released from it on all the streaming services is the Connie Converse song. So if you're curious to hear what we're talking about, it's out in the world, and it's called One by One. If you do a search on Julia Bullock, Connie Converse, One by One.
Shameless.
That I can be shameless. It's incredibly beautiful. Jill, do we have some questions?
We do. Thank you so much, everyone. So our first question is from Mika, and Mika says, they want to say first, this is absolutely lovely and inspiring. They have lots of artistry questions, but first, taking a practical route. They're seeing a long list of supporters on the donate page, and would love to hear you speak about the various ways you've secured funding and financing for AMOC in the earlier days and the present.
I can speak to that briefly. I think we have been fortunate that a lot of people who support the arts in New York and across the country did know the work of many individual AMOC artists, in some cases, many of them. So it was relatively easy, especially for Zach. You know, Zach has been certainly the lead fundraising force in the early years of the company, to kind of say, you believe in these artists, just imagine what they can all do together, or just, you know, sometimes it would be a specific project that would get folks excited. But because of the high wattage of creativity of the folks involved, it didn't feel like we were starting from zero. And then in more recent years, we've benefited from some really generous grants from larger organizations. That, of course, takes a few years for a company to establish itself. But that's a bigger part of how AMOC operates these days.
And one of the selling points, to put it just sort of more crudely, that was pitched to everyone who was contributing to AMOC early on, and which is something that we have really maintained and felt strongly about, is that everyone who's involved with AMOC for a project is getting paid the same amount. So whether you are a soloist, quote unquote soloist, or if you're a stage manager, choreographer, whatever your role is in a project, everyone is getting its equity across the board in terms of payment. And so that is something that we've communicated. With larger projects, it makes some of them very, very expensive, which I know for some of the members on our board has been like, what are we doing? You know, and is this worth it? It's like, yes, it's worth it, because again, we all feel we're coming into the space equally respected as contributing artists and human beings. So yeah, but Matt already summarized where we began and how we're continuing to go.
And it's also important to note, we've talked about some very large scale processes. AMOC also works in an almost infinite number of smaller subgroups. You know, a couple of weekends ago, I saw Bobbi and Ara dancing a new piece they've made to music of Philip Glass with Connor Hannock playing. Keir is involved in a project we originated in Ojai called With Carolyn Chen of How to Fall Apart, which will go to the Baryshnikov Arts Center with a much smaller subgroup. So there's plenty of room within AMOC for the large and the small. Other questions, Jill?
Great, thank you. And so Omar asks if you could talk more about how you sell the unique interdisciplinary work to your audience and how you determine who your target audience is. Omar's wondering if you factor this into your decision making, or if you take more of an if you build it, they will come approach.
My experience is that AMOC's relationships has been most often with presenters who are already sympathetic to multidisciplinary work, who present a range of things. Is that accurate?
I mean, it's honestly not always entirely clear who like the target audience or presenter is necessarily. Like, oftentimes things are made before there is a sort of booking or even interest. So I would tend towards the latter one, but I mean, like, the processes are different across the board. So it really depends. Yeah.
Yeah, there have certainly been projects like Doug Balliot's Rome is Falling opera, which was conceived for a young audience, with participation of kids and with, but the thing about not having a fixed home base or a fixed so-called audience means that it does change all the time. And we certainly take into account the nature of the experience, that we want our projects to feel immediate and immersive, accessible in the best sense of the word. But we work in such different spaces and such different locations that it's not a fixed thing.
And sometimes I'm guessing it's faith in that a presenter has in some member or members of AMOC, and that person brings the rest of AMOC with them. So that, there may be a dance presenter who has a relationship with Bobbi, and it becomes natural to bring Bobbi's project involving lots of people, or a music presenter who's familiar with your work, Matt, who then, acts on faith that this project you're bringing will expand their reach. So I think it's some of all of the above. It's complicated.
Great, thanks everyone. Our next question is from George, who's hoping that you all can talk more about the experience and the relationship between AMOC and the recent Ojai Music Festival.
Ojai loves AMOC. How's that for the short answer? We're in love, so it's, and now I just wish we could do every year together, but it was, the Ojai Festival has a very unusual structure in that there's a different music director each year, and so it reinvents itself each year. Last year the music director was John Adams. This year the music director was AMOC. Next year the music director is Rhiannon Giddens. So each festival will be wildly different from the previous one, and that's part of the audience's expectation is we're going to go on an adventure, and I have faith. And so, love aside, it's like a situation tailor-made for a group like AMOC, because the audience will just on faith go where the artists take them, and I think that proved to be the case.
Thank you. So our next question is from Julia Bentley, who's wondering how important is the shared or disparate lived experiences of the collaborators?
I mean, I don't want to answer for AMOC. My answer from observation and living with the company is it's actually central and vital. I think it's all of the lived experiences that in the most sensitive way tug at each other and actually form the pieces. And the other thing I want to say is AMOC is actually 17 core performing artists and some key collaborators in production and administrative areas. But in any number of pieces, AMOC may bring in guest artists who then also expand that universe of experience. And that was very much in evidence in Broken Theater, in open rehearsal, because Stephanie Troyak, who danced with the Pina Bausch Company and is an actor as well as a dancer, or Vincent Fraley, who danced with Bill T. Jones, but sings in a way that melts your heart forever, were key additional members to that piece that further expanded and created community. So I think it's every perspective within each piece informs the very nature of the piece.
I would add that I do think it's important. I mean, there are many forms of lived experience, and some are not shareable or necessarily knowable. But I do think it's important that there is a kind of generational affinity within the group. I mean, which I think is important for creating a sense of equality. I mean, there are some substantial differences in age and experience, but I would maybe characterize those as being big brother, big sister kinds of relationships, as opposed to parent-child or mentor-student ones. And I do think that's been really essential, to feel like we're all on this journey together and we have things to learn from each other. But we're all at this place where we're relatively young, but out in the world working. And I do think that's a really interesting question for the long-term future of the company. I think this may relate to the next question about the size of the membership and so forth, because we don't want for it to just be us forever. We do want it to be this group for a while more, but we do want there to be a regeneration. And I think it's going to be a really interesting question in the company's future for how we make ourselves sustainable and regenerative.
One question that I meant to ask much earlier on is of interest to many people at New Music USA is, as a musician, how do you even take the first step of finding a collaborative artist? And Matt, maybe as a composer, you get the pride of place in answering that question. How did you start on this journey, and how do you find cross-disciplinary soulmates?
Oh, I feel like I've been answering too many, so I want to hear other people's answers to this too. But gosh, I mean, Keir, you and I met in the middle of college, so I mean, I learned a lot from Keir about writing for the violin, writing for practical things like that. So it's not always something that you go out and look for. You don't go shopping. It happens organically. You work in opera, you work with people, you work with dozens or hundreds of people, and every once in a while you feel a spark. You feel that someone is a little bit bored within the process. You feel like someone has more ideas than a project can contain. And those are the people that you continue the conversation with over drinks, and it goes from there.
Great. Well, we just have a couple more minutes, so we've got a great number of questions in the chat. So if we don't get to your question today, I'm going to be copying all of them and I'll send them to the group and we'll try to get the answers for you. But we have a question from a student in the SFA composition studio who'd like to hear more about how AMOC balances the business realities inherent in these projects with the artistic goals.
My observation, again, while we wait for them to answer, is
just a big question to answer on in a minute.
Yeah, it's what Julia said about the equal pay for everybody. It's the collective consciousness informs the practical and financial and business decisions as well. And I mean, I know it sounds simplistic, but looking after each individual and everybody is looking after the collective whole. And I've been aware of that in the very pragmatic, financial or rehearsal schedule or whatever dimension, the same sensibility and core values inform it. Is that fair?
Does anyone else have thoughts on this one? I don't want to hog.
Go for it, Matt. You're not hogging.
Well, I would just say a couple things. One is that, to be frank, none of us make our full livings from AMOC, so we don't want to make it seem like it's this fully utopian thing that can take care of all needs. And then I would just ask, you asked about business realities, and I would just counter with what business realities? Which ones? We're not trying to be Justin Bieber. It's not like we're existing to to make the biggest, most commercially successful things. And if that's not your goal, it is actually possible to find a sustainable level of support if you're not expecting, you know, an unrealistic kind of pop level of quote success. So we've really just asked the question of what kind of work do we really need to make, and then you go out and find the support, and it's out there. It's out there in many forms. It's out there in the form of institutional partners who want to work to bring your stuff into their space, like Ara and the Ojai Festival. It's out there in the forms of individuals who want to support work. It's, you know, it's hard, but it's possible.
I think I would also add, oh, sorry. I would also add to that like the business reality is like the business, quote unquote, business reality is very different for every person and every project. I mean, like, like some people in the group have like tremendously successful like careers in opera, which is just an industry that has a ton of more money than dance or, you know, the composition of new music. Like there are these discrepancies and realities, and like, you know, we commissioned Carolyn Chen, who's like by day SAT tutor and by night like a brilliant composer who's like beloved in the underground LA contemporary music scene. So I just, you know, I feel like that it's kind of like leading with the art and the needs of the art, which are tremendously different across the board. So yeah, but I mean, it's not to deny that like we have been extremely, you know, like lucky and successful in our fundraising, but it's like that doesn't mean that it's like sort of like homogenous across the board, the way that it works financially. So.
And I mean, I love the conversations also when we're talking about production and how we get an idea off the ground, that the creativity and the collaboration goes all the way through all aspects of what makes a piece. And it's not necessarily just like, this is how it has to happen, let's raise that money. It's creative all the way to, you know, how schedules are put together. How do we create the same listening and the same kind of joy inside the studio, also how it's surrounded, how the piece is also surrounded and supported.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. And we're out of time for today. There are still some great questions in the chat, so I'm going to copy all those down and try to get answers for everyone that we didn't get to today. But I know I speak on behalf of everyone here when I thank everyone on our panel today. This is such a terrific and inspiring conversation, and we're so grateful that you could be here to share your insights with everyone. We have recorded today's webinar and we'll be posting it on New Music USA's YouTube channel so that everyone who's here can go back and revisit any parts they particularly connected with or share it with their networks too. So thank you all again so much for being here, and thank you also to the members of our New Music USA community for being here. Really appreciate it. And if anyone has any, closing salutations you'd like to make on your own, please feel invited to.
Just thank you, and lovely to be with everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And so to close us off today, for anyone who has a spare few minutes, I'm going to play a special video. As some people may know, New Music USA is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, which we're very excited about. So to close us out, I'm going to play our very short special 10th anniversary video, which features an array of our grantees from the last decade. So thank you again, and goodbye, everyone. See you next time.